This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here this morning. This is the webinar for the Sarasota Bay Partners Grants Program. I still see a number of people logging on at this point, so I'm going to give everyone another maybe 60 seconds or so just to get as many people on as we can before I begin. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you again for joining us for the Sarasota Bay Partners Grants informational webinar this morning. I'd like to spend the first half hour or so of this webinar giving you an overview of our grants program, and then at the end, I will take as many questions as we can before noon. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Darcy Young. I am the Director of Planning and Communications with the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program. I'm putting my contact information up here so that you can jot that down right at the start, as well as the link to the webpage on our website that has all of the information that I'll be talking about today, sarasota.bay.org/grants. This is my 7th cycle of the Sarasota Bay Partners Grants Program that I have managed. So I've seen a lot. I won't say I've seen everything, but I am open anytime for questions and comments about the grant program. I do a lot of technical consultations with groups that might have a project idea, but they're not quite sure where they want to go with it. So if you have any ideas like that, please feel free to reach out anytime. I'm happy to consult with you. Before we really get into it, I'd like to tell you a bit about the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program for those of you who aren't familiar with us. Our mission as a program is really simply to restore and protect Sarasota Bay. We work essentially between Anna Maria Island and the Venice Inlet, and we work in partnership with a lot of other organizations, from community organizations and schools to governments, including the federal government. We operate as a state agency. We are codified as an independent special district of the state of Florida through our interlocal agreement, which provides our funding from the Environmental Protection Agency to local governments, including Sarasota County, Manatee County, the Southwest Florida Water Management District, the city of Sarasota, the city of Bradenton, and the town of Longboat Key. We were established in 1989, and ever since then, we've been working on habitat restoration, water quality, and community engagement around Sarasota Bay. And at some point, I'd love to tell you all more about what we do, but that's not the topic for today. The topic for today is our Sarasota Bay Partners Grants Program. The mission of the program is to provide financial and technical support for community partners engaged in projects that will benefit Sarasota Bay. We acknowledge that as a small staff at the Estuary program, we only have 5 full-time staff. We really can't do everything on our own, and we need as many community partners as we can to get our mission done. So the grants program was founded to increase the number of organizations that participate in bay restoration. The grant program was started in 2003, and since then we've awarded over $400,000 to more than 100 community organizations through the program. This year we are upping the ante. We are making $100,000 available. This is doubling what we made available last year and tripling at least what we've made available in previous years. If you're wondering where this additional funding is coming from, we are fortunate as one of 28 national estuary programs in the United States to be receiving funding from the recently signed bipartisan infrastructure bill. So we've decided to capitalize on the success of this grants program and make more money available than we usually do. We've also decided to raise the maximum award that we will accept per project or organization to $10,000. In previous years, that's been $3,000 or $4,000. So we're really hoping to see some bigger ideas this year. And before we get too much further, I want to make sure everyone is aware that Bay Partners grants are reimbursement grants. This means that we don't award the money up front. You need to make some progress on your project before we will reimburse you those funds. And we recognize that this can be a challenge for some of the smaller community organizations that we really aim to reach with this funding. So we do have some ways of working with you to make this feasible, and I'll go over those a little bit later. In terms of organizational eligibility for these grants, we don't have very many restrictions on this. We accept applications from nonprofits, for-profits, schools, and government organizations. All you need really is a federal employer identification number, an FEIN, or a state tax exemption. And most organizations, the way that they provide this to me is a W-9 form. So we don't award funds to individuals, but most other organizations are eligible. If you have questions about that, I can answer that as well. We do restrict project eligibility though. So projects need to take place within the greater Sarasota Bay watershed. That's because this is where our funding is restricted as an estuary program. So we don't fund projects ourselves outside of this area. So our grants program can't expand past this area either. So essentially you can think of our area as coming from Anna Maria Island down to the Venice Inlet. And then that eastern boundary is a little bit harder to define. It kind of follows I-75, but not quite. So if you're not sure if your project is within this area, we have an interactive map on sarasotobay.org/grants. You can click on that map and zoom into your project area just to make sure that you're in the right spot. If you're still not sure, please just give me a call. In terms of the types of eligible projects that we're looking for, they generally fall into 3 categories: habitat restoration and water quality, bay-related environmental education, and community outreach and stewardship. You can see that there are a number of example projects here, from native plantings to development of bay-related programming for K-12 schools to community science or citizen science monitoring that's bay-related. So there are a lot of different projects that fit under this umbrella, but what we're really looking for is projects that will do in-ground habitat restoration and or engage youth and the broader community in bay restoration. The one type of project that I'd like to go into a little bit more depth on right now is green infrastructure. And the reason for that is that it is our 2022 priority issue. Our Citizens Advisory Committee voted this year to prioritize this issue. And the reason for that is that stormwater runoff, which is the rain that falls on the watershed and flows into Sarasota Bay, is a major source of pollution in our watershed. It contributes up to 72% of the total nitrogen load to the bay. And this is an issue because nitrogen is the primary driver of algae blooms in Sarasota Bay. We're interested in reducing the number of algae blooms that we get. I think everybody is. And green infrastructure is one way to get us there. And that's because traditionally cities have used gray infrastructure, which is what you think of as the gutters, pipes, and tunnels that take that stormwater and move it away from your house and your streets so that you don't experience a lot of street flooding. It's good at that, What it's not so good at doing, oh dear. Let's see, can folks hear me now? Thank you for those messages. I'm seeing messages that I'm breaking up. How do I sound now? Good, okay, thank you, great. All right, maybe I'll just slow my roll a little bit here. I get excited talking about stormwater. So with gray infrastructure, like our traditional pipes and tunnels, that does a great job at moving the stormwater away from our homes and our streets. What it doesn't do so well is process that stormwater and filter it, so that any of those pollutants that it picks up, like nutrients and bacteria and sediments, none of that gets filtered out before it reaches our bays. Green infrastructure is a set of techniques that attempt to filter that stormwater before it reaches our bays. So what green infrastructure is trying to do is recreate the basically the roles that wetlands used to play in our environments, where they would take up that rainwater and the plants and soils would filter out those pollutants before it reached the bays. And green infrastructure is a way of trying to make that work in city environments. So what you can see here is an example of a bioswale that uses plants and soils to filter that stormwater from these roads. And let's look at a couple more examples of green infrastructure projects. They include things like rain gardens. There on the left. What a rain garden is basically just a depression in the land that tries to absorb stormwater, usually from a roof, and recharge aquifers rather than letting that stormwater run off into surface waters. That's a great option if you have green space available. If you don't, say you're in downtown Bradenton or downtown Sarasota, you might have better luck with something like a downspout planter box, which is something that takes that gutter runoff from your roof. You can see that downspout there going straight into that downspout planter box, and then that filters and slows down that stormwater before discharging it. We also have quite a number of bioswales in the community. They basically look like a grassy depression that's been planted. So you might not notice them, but they're similar to rain gardens, except their purpose is to keep channeling that water further along. So you can think of them kind of as a stormwater pipe that's been opened up and planted with plants. And then the final example I'll give you here is permeable pavement. So this is an option where if you have an area that does need to be paved, for example, a parking lot or maybe a walking area, what you can do for stormwater benefits is to use permeable pavement instead of impervious pavement. So through our grants program, one thing we're interested in helping fund is transitioning some of these hardened surfaces like parking lots to permeable pavement. These are just 4 examples of green infrastructure. If you're looking for more, you can visit our website or Google EPA green infrastructure. They have a lot of different examples. And if you're not sure if your project counts as green infrastructure, please just reach out to me. A few benefits of green infrastructure include cleaner water, flood protection, wildlife habitat, green space, urban heat island reduction, especially for projects that implement tree plantings, groundwater replenishment, and climate resiliency. So again, our Citizens Advisory Committee voted to prioritize this year. And the way that we will do that is we will award 5 additional points to applications that address green infrastructure. So either by implementing a green infrastructure project, like I just mentioned, or that primarily are intended to educate people about green infrastructure. This doesn't mean that if you have a project that doesn't address this priority, say you have a project that is intending to help protect shorebirds, that doesn't mean we don't want to see your project. We absolutely do. It's just that it wouldn't be awarded these 5 additional points. Okay, so let's talk a bit about some ineligible projects. We do not fund projects on private property that is owned by individuals. So while we absolutely encourage people to install rain gardens on their own private property, we can't fund that. We don't fund projects that don't include a community outreach or involvement component. So what this means is that if you are an HOA or a neighborhood, maybe you have a stormwater pond that you want to plant, that's great. But you'll need to think of ways to involve the community in that planting, either through volunteers or through some kind of open house event for the pond. We can't fund you just to hire a contractor to plant and be done with it. We don't fund projects that basically add or repair non-natural features. This includes things like, benches, swimming pools, fish ponds, things that most people wouldn't think of applying for. The one exception here that I want to mention is replacement of an already impervious surface with a pervious surface. So if you have a parking lot, say you're a business owner, you have a small parking lot, you're interested in converting it to a pervious parking lot, that is something that we would fund through this program. We don't fund ongoing administrative support of established programs. So say you have an environmental camp, and you're just looking for funding to pay your camp counselors this year. Unfortunately, that's not an appropriate use of this grant funding. What would be appropriate in that situation is if you were interested in developing new programming for the kids in your camp. That would be appropriate. Just requesting funds to continue the programming that you already have would not be. And then finally, we don't fund any projects related to lobbying, compliance, regulation, code enforcement, mitigation, or penalties. Okay, let's get into a few, I see Kathy's question. Yes, we are recording this webinar right now, and this will be posted online for viewing later on. Thank you. All right, I'd like to get into a few details about the grant application now. The application is available on our website, as well as this information packet that I keep referencing at sarasotabay.org/grants. Some key dates that are good to be aware of. First, the application due date is March 1st. Between April and May 2022, I'll be running around to our various committees and boards getting approvals of these projects that we recommend. By May 20th, 2022, that's when you'll receive an email from me that's notifying you of the status of your award. And then if you are awarded, there are some dates to be aware of. June 1st is the deadline for you to return and sign the grant agreement. You have 2 progress reports that are due. The first one on October 31st, 2022, the second on March 31st, 2023. You will receive templates for both of those reports, so you don't have to come up with it on your own. And then your project, the SBEP funded portion of your project needs to be completed with the final report and invoice submitted to me by August 31st of 2023. So essentially we give you about maybe a year and a third to do your project between being approved in mid-May through when it needs to be completed in end of August of 2023. The application form, we have 2 options for it. We have an online form using the website JotForm, and we have a Word fillable form. It is up to you 100%, whichever way you would like to go on this. They both have the same questions. They will be scored exactly the same way. Both of them give you the option of saving your progress and going back later, even the online form, which I think is pretty cool. I will say one note in favor of the online form is if you are submitting an application with a lot of big attachments, say you want to send me a bunch of photos and maps to go along with your application, I recommend using the online form because it has an upload function that works really well for those big files. I've run into a lot of trouble in the past with folks wanting to email me big files. So what I would do in that case is either use the online application or upload those files to a website like WeTransfer or Dropbox or something, and then sending me the link rather than trying to email me the attachment, because that often runs into trouble. Okay, so getting into the information that you actually need to put in your application, the first thing that we ask you for is your organization information. For some of you, this will be really simple, but for those of you that might be working in partnerships with other organizations, you might want to put a bit of thought into who is going to apply for the project, because the lead organization is the organization that has to be the one that issues the invoices to me and will be the only organization that receives any reimbursement from me or from SBEP. So we don't pay any outside invoices that aren't from that lead organization. We don't directly pay subcontractors or partner organizations. So that lead organization needs to be the funnel for those funds. And so that lead needs to have a federal employer identification number or a state tax exemption. I'm happy to answer any questions about that. And then organizations that have not received a Bay Partners grant within the past 3 years will be awarded an additional 5 points during scoring. So if you've applied for one in the past 3 years, but you haven't been awarded, you will still receive that additional 5 points. And the purpose of this is just to broaden the reach of our grants and try to award to more organizations and get more organizations into the process of helping restore Sarasota Bay. Next up is the logic model. This is something we implemented fairly recently, and it sounds complicated, but what it's really meant to be is an executive summary of your project. What it does is it gives our grants review committee a comprehensive and concise bird's eye view of your project. So rather than just diving directly into your scope of work and telling us all the details about what you want to do, it gives them a sense from beginning to end of what you want to do. And that actually really helps them read through your application in a more concise and comprehensive way. And what it does for you is it helps you envision and think through how your project supports one or more of our goals to improve water quality, increase wildlife habitat, and increase community engagement. So for this section, we really highly encourage bulleted lists of brief phrases. These don't even have to be full sentences, rather than narratives. You'll have plenty of space for narratives later. All we really want here is bulleted lists, giving us the high-level overview. Here we go. This is where you get to start putting in your narrative. This is the project description section. This is where you give us your scope of work. This is where I encourage you to attach photos, maps, lesson plans, anything that will help the grants review committee envision what you're trying to do. This is the section where you demonstrate that your group has or will seek out the expertise to carry out the project. This is where you'll tell us about your timeline. And remember when you're writing this up that you need to complete the SBEP funded portion by August 31st of 2023. And this part will also tell you about the permits and permissions for your project. So I want to spend just a moment on this because it's a little bit nuanced. We do not require permits in hand to apply for a Bay Partners grant. You should know upfront whether or not you'll need one and tell us that. But we don't require you to have the permit in hand. We do require what I call permissions in hand. And what I mean by permissions is if you are wanting to work on someone else's property, you need to have that permission up front. This is really, we only run into this when, say, we're working with a neighborhood that has a city park in the neighborhood and they want to do a tree planting, for example. They would need to submit proof of permission from the city to do that project with their application. And this can be really simple. Basically, what I want you to do is notify someone with the property owner that you want to do this project and ask them to send you maybe just a brief email that is in support of the project. And then you can submit that as a letter of support. So it's nothing too complicated, but it is something we like to have up front because it's challenging for us to approve a project if we don't know if the property owner is even aware that it's happening. Okay, next up is environmental benefits. These are fairly self-explanatory, but what you want to do here is demonstrate that the project will make a lasting positive impact on Sarasota Bay. You want to show us that you're following current guidelines for best practices in habitat restoration and water quality, and that you're consulting local experts. This is where you can tell us that you're not just Googling Reddit solutions to your problem. If you have say you have an environmental education project and you're not exactly sure how to frame this, really what we look for here is describing how the project will encourage positive behavior change among the participants that will last for years into the future. Next up is the community benefits section. Again, projects must include community involvement. You need to tell us an estimate of the number of community participants when you submit your application. We really highly encourage letters of support from partners, expert advisors, board members, and other project stakeholders. And we actively seek applications for projects that are led by or that empower, benefit, and engage environmental justice communities that have been negatively impacted by environmental policies or environmental conditions. Project evaluation is the second to last step. And this is where you'll tell us how you will measure the success of your project. So you can take some ideas from your logic model. If you page back to that, there's a couple of sections called outputs and outcomes. This is where you'll tell us what you'll measure in your project. And this really depends on what kind of project you're trying to do. Some possibilities include measuring the survival of plantings after 3 months, measuring the regrowth of exotic invasive vegetation after 3 months, perhaps the number of attendees at different outreach events. These are just some ideas. We encourage you to get creative and again, reach out to me if you have questions about what to put here. And then this is also the section where you'll need to describe a maintenance plan for any projects that make physical alterations to the environment. And we do require at least a 5-year maintenance period. I'll go into that a little bit later, but this is the section where you'll need to tell us how you're going to keep your plants watered, who's going to be looking after those plants and making sure that they survive year to year, things like that. And then finally is the budget proposal section. Remember, Bay Partners grants are reimbursement grants. And in order to try to work with smaller organizations that may not be able to bankroll the full cost of the award at one time, you can invoice SBEP as often as monthly for approved budget expenses, as long as you send a small project update along with that invoice. So most organizations opt to invoice us all at one time, but we do work with several organizations that do like to invoice more frequently, just to make sure that they don't have a huge negative balance in their own budgets. That's absolutely fine. And you know, it can be useful to tell me up front when you're applying that that's what you would like to do, but you don't need to. You'll just need to let me know when you've been awarded that you would like to invoice more frequently. So in that case, what would happen is you would make purchases, you would tally up those purchases, put them in a single invoice for me, letting me know how much of that grant you want reimbursed at that time. You'd send me a really small progress report, and then I would get that check processed. Our deadline is within 30 days of receiving a check, but we're usually much quicker than that. So for your budget proposal, you'll use the form in the application, or if you don't like that one or you need more space, you can create your own spreadsheet using the same format and upload or attach it to your application. And we ask you to include as many details as possible. I'm going to go through a couple of examples here to show you what I mean by that. First, I'll show you a no good, very bad budget. This person being me, I made these example budgets. This person made a budget that does not include enough information for the review committee to determine whether or not these costs are allowable and reasonable. So for example, looking at that first line item, plants, $2,000, that doesn't tell the review committee anything about whether or not those plants are native. This person could be planning to spend $2,000 planting Australian pine trees, which are of course exotic invasives. They could be spending $2,000 on one single tree. These are things that are really important for us to know. For that mulch, same thing. We don't know how many bags you're getting for that. We don't know what kind of mulch it is. Same idea with the outreach materials and the labor. And there's no details here about where that match is coming from. Is that volunteer hours? Is that cash? This budget doesn't tell us. So let's look at a great budget. This is for the same example project, but giving a lot more details that we need. So for example, looking at the plants here, you can see that this budget specifies how many plants of each species and how big this person wants to purchase, and then the per plant cost. So that lets the review committee see that these are definitely allowed costs. These are all native plants, and that the costs are reasonable because we compare those per plant costs to ones that we're aware of. It gives a lot of details about the educational materials that we're paying for printing costs. So again, we can see that those costs are reasonable and expected. It gives a lot more detail in terms of the labor. It tells us that there are quotes attached to the application for both of the types of labor that they want reimbursement for, graphic design and a landscape contractor. And then it also gives us tons of detail about what match they're providing. We can see that there is a certain amount of match that is cash, and then a certain amount that is volunteer labor. On the next page, I will tell you about how to calculate volunteer labor as match. We encourage match, but we don't require it. And you can use volunteer time as match. So what you'll do is multiply the number of expected volunteer hours by the current hourly rate for volunteer time in Florida, which right now is $26.32 per hour. So let's talk about allowed costs. These categories are really broad, but it includes things like materials and supplies, professional services. On those example budgets that I just gave, that included the graphic design as well as the landscape contractor. We encourage getting quotes and submitting those with your application when you can. Salary of lead organization employees is allowed. It's limited to 25% of your total award. Indirect costs are also allowed. They're limited to 10% of the direct costs in your award. We do allow equipment purchases or equipment costs, including rental, maintenance, repair, and then sometimes purchase. For purchasing equipment, we do ask you to, give some special effort for justifying that in your application. And if it's an equipment purchase over $1,500, we ask that you submit 3 quotes with your application. For meetings and conferences, we do allow those costs for hosting only. This section can get into the weeds a little bit with whether or not the costs are allowed or unallowed. So if you are at all interested in applying for funds to hold a meeting or a conference, I recommend reaching out to me to review your budget, just to make sure that all the costs are allowed. And then we do allow food and drink costs. They're limited to 10% of your award. And then if you take a look at the Bay Partners Grant information packet, that includes some additional restrictions that we have to abide by state statute for. Okay, unallowed costs include a lot of things that you would expect, but I'll mention a couple here that come up with some frequency, including entertainment. So if you're trying to hold an event, we can't reimburse for things like paying musicians. We don't reimburse for alcohol, of course, and then attendance at conferences and meetings. We can reimburse hosting costs, but not attendance. Okay. So finally, you've submitted your application, you're done, and now you sit back and wait for a little while I run around. And the first thing that I do is I go to our grants review committee. It consists of 6 individuals who are either members of our Citizens Advisory Committee or our local environmental experts who review and score the grant applications based upon a rubric that we give them. I'll go over that rubric now. So you can receive 5 points if you haven't received a Bay Partners grant within the past 3 years. You get 5 points if your project addresses the 2022 priority of green infrastructure. You can receive up to 20 points for your project description, 25 for environmental benefits, 25 for community involvement, 10 for project evaluation, and 10 for budget proposal, for a total of 100 points. So your project will be reviewed by the Grants Review Committee. Each person will score the application, and then during that review committee meeting, we'll go through and discuss each project in detail, at which point anyone on the review committee can change their initial score. Maybe they learned something during that discussion that changes their mind about the score. And then once that's settled, I take those scores and average them across all of the reviewers, and then the Grants Review Committee comes up with a list of recommended projects based on those scores. Board recommendations and approvals. This is the timeline for that. You don't really need to worry about this too much because I'll be communicating with you the whole way, but just to let you know, on April 4th, we will have that Grants Review Committee meeting, and they will forward their recommendations to our Citizens Advisory Committee. If the Citizens Advisory Committee likes those project recommendations, they will forward them to our Management Board, which meets on April 22nd. If the Management Board likes those, they'll forward them to our Policy Board. Our Policy Board is composed of local elected and appointed officials, and they make our final approvals on all of our budgetary items. So if they like those projects, they will approve them during their May 13th meeting. And then by May 20th, 1 week later, you'll hear from me with a notification of your award status. Okay, just a little bit of fine print here. We're really close to being done. Project maintenance expectations. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. For projects that make physical alterations to the environment, awardees need to commit to maintaining the project for at least 5 years post-installation. If during that time period we find out that the project hasn't been maintained well or has been totally removed, we have the right to disqualify the awardee from future Bay Partners funding for 5 years. We're going to try really hard to make this not happen. So if there's a grantee that's just having trouble maintaining the project, they're not quite sure, they've got an exotic invasive coming in and it's ruining the project and they're not sure what to do about it, our first step will be to try to help you maintain the project. But say in the case where there's an HOA pond and one board is really gung-ho and wants to plant all the plants and gets a grant, but then the next board wants to take them all out, in that case, we would be disqualifying that awardee from future funding for the next 5 years. Okay, I've mentioned all these dates before. These are some communications and reporting requirements for awardees. I will be forwarding awardees templates for the progress reports and the final reports, so you don't need to come up with those on your own. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about funding acknowledgement. We ask that grant awardees acknowledge SBEP Bay Partners grant funding in any media coverage, social media posts and websites about the project, publications about the project, and any signage. So if you're doing an in-ground habitat restoration or water quality project, you can apply to us for funds to make signage, and we ask in that case that you put our logo on it. If you'd rather not do the signage, you can just ask us for a generic sign that basically just has our logo and says this project has been funded in part by a Sarasota Bay Partners grant, and that we can provide to you at no additional cost. So that's your choice. And we'll be forwarding our logo as well as some example language to all of the awardees for this funding acknowledgement. And we ask that you do this because you all are really our voices in the community and help us get the word out about these grants. And without you, we wouldn't have as many people coming to us for this grant funding. We'd have fewer partners helping us with bay restoration. So that's the reason why we ask you to do this. And with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Again, this is my contact information. Please contact me anytime with questions, comments, or just to talk over an idea. I mean it when I say this is my favorite part of my job. I really do love January to March. I get to talk to so many new different people about fun projects. So please do reach out to me anytime. And with that, I will open it up for questions. So what I'll ask you to do is please use the chat box to type in your question, or you can also type in a request to speak up. And I'll go ahead and see if there's any questions in there already. Okay, a few questions. Yes, the video will be distributed online following the presentation. Cynthia, do you tell us where to get plants? I can certainly give recommendations for local nurseries that would be able to provide some of these plants. And then let's see, for equipment purchases, do we need 3 bids or 2? 3 bids, please. And then media contacts, we do have some. So if you're an organization that is looking for media exposure for your project, we could certainly work with you on something like a joint release that helps get the word out. Will you pay for downspouts? We can pay for downspouts, yes. Those would be included in the green infrastructure priority. Okay, let's see. Do HOAs count as a community? Yes, HOAs, I think, are you asking if HOAs are eligible? In which case, yes, HOAs are eligible to apply. And then if you're building a swale, can you pay for the fill material? Yes, we can. Any construction costs related with building that bioswale, we can reimburse. Okay. Well, if there are no further questions now, I want to thank everyone again for attending the webinar. Oh, one more here. Can we count you as an in-kind donation for another grant? You can count us as in-kind for another grant. What I would do is wait until you have that grant award letter and then use that as the documentation. Yep. Okay, I think that's it. They're slowing down now. So if there are additional questions, again, feel free to email or call me anytime. I will be turning off this recording and making this available online for everyone to watch later on. So thanks again, everyone, for your time, and I look forward to hearing from you. Bye-bye.